Thanks for downloading this episode of Start the Week. For more details about Start the Week, please go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. I hope you enjoy the programme. Hello, we are approaching the end of what has been an interesting and possibly even momentous year in the politics of Scotland, which means the country will vote in 2014 on leaving the United Kingdom or not, and there's already campaigning going on both sides. A campaign so long it will make US presidential contests look like a hop and a skip. Today we're talking not about voting systems or economic models, but something both vaguer and also more important, which is the mood of the country. I'm joined by some of Scotland's most prominent writers. The pioneer Glaswegian pedestrian Alasdair Gray, whose novel Lanark inspired a generation of writers and whose collected short stories have just been published. By the cultural commentator and journalist Joyce Macmillan. By Scotland's best-known current historian Tom Devine, and by the only begetter of Rebus, Edinburgh's own criminal mastermind Ian Rankin. Thanks to all of you. Can we just start with a bit of a historical perspective, Professor Devine? We've seen a very, very intense series of changes in Scottish politics with the rise of the SNP and stuff over the last 20 years and so on. We now have a date for the referendum, still arguments over the actual question itself. Is all of this percolating into sort of endless public debate in Scotland?
Well, some people say it's become so endless, it's become humdrum because, there has aspects to the debate which perhaps are not as productive so far as people thought they might be. But I think if people take a kind of long historical lens on this, I mean, we are living through truly historic times, because you'll recall that, the Union itself was hardly challenged, not even in terms of reforming it, between the mid-18th century and the 1960s and 1970s. So whatever happens in 2014, this is going to be a period that future scholars in my discipline will have to try and explain how this came about.
Sort of asymmetric climate change, sudden global warming or something like that.
At the moment, it's a semi-mystery.
Yes. Ian Rankin, same sort of question. What do you? I mean, you, in all of your Rebus novels, we always see something of what's going on in Scotland at the time. References.
Well, I mean, it certainly seems to be something that is filling the pages of newspapers and hours of radio and occasionally on TV, but I don't get a sense when you're in the shops or the pub or the cafes that it's the hottest topic on people's minds. And in some way that might be because of the saturation in the media, that every day in the media there's something else you can be reading on this, and it will be an opposing point of view. It will be an economist saying, no, that economist yesterday was completely wrong. So there's nothing for you to cling on to. And so what we tend to do is just go about our business and try and make it through the recession.
Alasdair Gray, you've had in your writing many sort of imagined empires, worlds, states, different kinds of Scotland and Scottishness. What do you make of the current mood?
I haven't the faintest idea. Current mood, like somebody in a feeling their temperature every minute or taking their pulse every minute to compare it with how it was an hour ago.
You don't feel you're living through a particularly momentous time in Scottish history at the moment?
History is continual. I don't think there's any year that is more momentous in the history of the world or the history of a nation than any other. There's every year has some form of political crisis. I mean, to me, the formative crisis that turned me towards from a solid Labour supporter into a Scottish supporter of Scottish Home Rule, if you don't mind me using an ancient phrase that the Irish were quite fond of, was the discovery that the welfare state, which I thought was the greatest, made post-war Britain an example to the rest of the world, was being steadily dismantled. And that's why I thought, well, the English Westminster government is doing it. The Scottish Labour Party is cooperating with it. Anyway, Salmon's government has abolished prescription charges and is ensuring that at least Scottish students at further colleges of education don't have to pay fees. They're trying to maintain a bit of or reinstate the welfare state that has been demolished in England. Good.
Good. All right, Joyce Macmillan, Scotland has a national theatre, but not a national theatre with walls. We're going to come in and talk about that a bit later on. But what's your take? Does this feel like a momentous time to you?
Well, it feels as if it's very momentous in terms of the formal politics, but I think it's also telling us things, and Ian hinted at this, about the relationship between formal politics and most people's lives, which is that it is, I think, all across the UK and maybe all across the West, increasingly tenuous. So the politicians and political journalists are tremendously excited about this run-up to 2014 and the debate that's going on and the technicalities. You know, this week the big story in Scotland has been a supposed scoop by my newspaper, The Scotsman, about the precise legalistic process that would be necessary for an independent Scotland to join the European Union. And stuff like that is very exciting to political wonks like me, to political journalists and to politicians. I don't think, as Ian says, that it's the talk of the steamy. And my feeling is that there is actually less popular engagement with these constitutional issues at the moment than there was in the 1990s in the run-up to the coming of the Scottish Parliament, which really was a momentous
when
change.
there were big social movements like the Convention.
Yes, and there was a huge consensus in Scottish civil society that Parliament was wanted and needed, whereas the question of full independence is quite divisive for Scottish society.
I think there's two reasons for this. First of all, as already been said, the depth of the national economic crisis is such that people have got much more pressing concerns in their daily lives and for their families. But the second reason is, I think, that 2014 has come about almost by political accident. It has not come about, as perhaps the Devolution Bill came about, by a rush of mass public opinion. Two things happened in Scotia in the early part of the millennium. First of all, the Labour Party's hegemony disintegrated and the SNP moved in. And the second thing is they have been seen, at least for the first two periods, to have been behaving competently in government. So they win a landslide victory, and because of that, they inevitably go for a referendum. But that referendum has come about through the, if you like, the intricacies of Scottish domestic politics, rather than a great wave of nationalism, as perhaps happened in the former Soviet Union. And of course, this is another reason why there's a big question mark over what's going to happen in 2014. And I think the big thing, from my point of view, is that the unionist parties in particular had better prepare for what might happen in terms of a no vote post-2014, because we do not want the emotional debacle which happened after 1979 and all that.
When you've often quoted, there was a famous cartoon on the front of the Glasgow Herald of the Scottish lion, huddled inside a cage with the door open, saying... Cowering. I'm no coming out because I'm feared. Translated to American audiences as I do as, I am not about to leave this cage because I am afraid. Yes, yes. Now, of course, we talk about, I talked about mood and so on, but different parts of Scotland and different generations will have very different takes on this. And Ian Rankin, you've got, of course, Rebus, who is now, how old is Rebus now? In his 66, 67?
No, he's not that old. Yeah, early 60s, shall we say.
Early 60s.
Still of working age.
And really is he?
Early 60s and wearing badly, I think it's fair to say. And he appears to be a Scot of that sort of unionist 1960s, 1970s make-up. He's certainly the music he listens to is sort of mainstream sort of British and American rock of that era. And yet he's got a younger colleague, Siobhan, who is perhaps more of a new Scot. That's a conscious kind of opposition of two different views of Scotland?
It wasn't. I mean, when I invented Siobhan, she was a sidekick who would be there to ask the questions the reader wanted to have answered. Oh my God, Holmes, how could you possibly have worked that out? It's the reason that Watson is there, and that was the reason that Rebus needed a sidekick. But she took on a life of her own, and you're quite right. She's a sort of younger Scot, a new Scot, more free-thinking than Rebus. He would vote no, she would vote yes. I think I'm somewhere in between. Maybe that's as it should be. Having invented both of them, that they comprise two sides of my personality. But in the new novel, I was, what I wanted to do was to get Rebus out of his comfort zone, to get him away from central Scotland, to get him away from Edinburgh, and show him that there are other Scotlands.
And you've pushed him up the A9.
Well, this is why the A9 was important, because to me it was a kind of spine that runs up the middle of Scotland and takes you to different places where people think very differently to the way they think in Edinburgh.
For those who don't know the A9, it's the main road going up the east side of Scotland, notoriously dangerous to motorists because it's not a dual carriageway all the way, and always very busy.
Yeah, and it takes you right up to the very north of Scotland, where all you can do is jump on a ferry and go to Orkney or Shetland. It's an important arterial road, but it has a life of its own, and it has a personality of its own, and the people who live on it and near it think in very different ways to the way people would think in Edinburgh or Glasgow.
It is one of the great cliches of sort of Scottish culture that Edinburgh and Glasgow are forever and eternally opposed. Is there an extent, however, that the East Coast looks in a different direction, is more part of the sort of German Sea, Nordic, Scandinavian world, whereas the West looks out across the Atlantic?
I mean, I don't know if it's a cliche or not. I mean, it's probably far too simplistic, but there is this notion that Glasgow, of course, is a much more Celtic place. It takes a lot of its people from... historically took them from Ireland. And Edinburgh always seemed a bit more Presbyterian, a bit more buttoned up. It seemed a colder place. They weren't as friendly, they weren't as outgoing, they weren't as chatty. And it was a city built on invisible industries, on things like banking and insurance. It didn't make things. And it's made it a place that kept its secrets very well, which is why it's great for a crime writer, because there seems to be stuff happening below the surface that we're not aware of, in a way that Glasgow is very much showing itself to the world on the surface. You go to Glasgow, everybody's interested in fashion in Glasgow. That's where all the big fashion outlets are. And in Edinburgh, they might look at the prices in Harvey Nicks and then go, that's horrifically expensive, I'll go and buy it somewhere else.
Yes.
That's very true.
And through the medium of Rebus, I mean, if anyone who wants to understand Scottish history, certainly the history of Edinburgh, can go back through the Rebus novels, and you'll find all sorts of changes happening to the Scottish capital. And what I'm going to ask is whether you've got 2 or 3 years ahead where you have another series of big events that you're going to have to incorporate in Rebus or other novels.
Well, there's no plan. Never has been a plan. I need to start a new book next month, and I've got nothing in my head. I've got no title, no plot, no theme, no nothing. I've got to think very quickly. Stuff usually does happen. This is the wonderful thing about living in Scotland at the present time, is there's usually something happening. And if it isn't happening in Scotland, it's happening somewhere else, and I can extrapolate from it and say, what if it happened in Scotland? So you can bring in anything from xenophobia to people trafficking, to the financial crisis, and you can set it in a Scottish context.
Alasdair Gray.
The thing I liked about your new novel, Ian, was the how contemporary it was. It emphasised the fact that the difference between the local, is it 4 police regions?
No, there's 8 at the moment, and there's going to just be 1.
Well, yes, the Inverness-based police zone, you might say, and the contrast with Edinburgh, and the fact that the unification of the lot is being promoted or discussed, you came across without offering an opinion on it, business of thinking something is going to be lost here. The usual business of local connection, and people being allowed to identify with the headquarters in their own neighbourhood.
Now you mention it, it seems to me it's moving in the opposite direction from the split up of the union, because what's happening in the Scottish police force is that all these little regional forces are being made into one huge conglomerate, and nobody's very sure what that's going to mean. And we're in the same situation with independence, that we might be splitting away and we've got no idea what it would mean.
Yeah, I mean, I also enjoyed the contemporaneous feeling in Ian's new book. But there's 2 aspects to it, partly to go back to what's already been said about Glasgow and Edinburgh. One of the things that always strikes me, for a very small country, both geographically and in terms of just over 5 million people, the number of microcultures and micro accents around, it never fails to amaze my American graduate students as they travel around Scotland, hopefully during the vacation, not when they should be working, about the range of these mini cultures. I think there's far too much emphasis, not least in the Scottish media, about the Central Belt. So it was refreshing to go up there. But the other thing, Ian, I thought was, it was almost the reverse of a Visit Scotland booklet, because I know some people around the table might disagree, but I thought the vision you gave of the North was quite bleak. The road of death, as has just been said, the number of accidents on it, although you don't mention that, becomes the road of killing in your book. And there's not, apart from the dolphin hunt, there's not very much in the way of touristic activity. And some of the people met en route are not all that pleasant or hospitable. So it's a refreshing blast of cold reality against some of the propaganda you get about the Bonnie Highlands.
There's another aspect to it. I mean, you indicate in, what was it, Markin? The place where the murderer...
Rosemarkie.
Rosemarkie.
Don't give it away.
Oh, sorry.
It's not Rosemarkie, it's Aberdeen.
But the presence of a neighbourliness in which people have faith and support for their neighbours and for their families, even though they may have some suspicion of that nonetheless they naturally cover up for each other because they believe that basically we're all decent, and that's frequent everywhere.
In some ways, it comes back to what Tom was saying. That there's this kind of, I don't want to use the word tribalism, but I'm going to. There's a sense that it's all we tribes. That when you go to a village, and you go from one village to the next, you're meeting a different tribe, and they've got a very different way of
when you
thinking
go
about
into
the
the
world.
bar and people look, where are you from?
It's a straw dogs moment.
But I mean, we can't go into this kind of neurotic particularism. I mean, you get that everywhere, where there's rural communities and where there's a tension between an urban centre and rural.
Not as if it's Deliverance,
I'm sure
is it?
you get it in rural Poland. I'm sure you get it in rural. Since you mentioned Deliverance, I'm sure you get it in some parts of the United States even. So I mean, I don't think it's a particularly Scottish characteristic but it is true that the nation is very, very diverse, and that it has this kind of west and east aspect to it. That's undoubtedly true. It has an Atlantic side and a North Sea side, and there are cultural and historic dimensions to that.
Well, let's turn a little bit more to the Atlantic side, Alasdair Gray, and look at your collection, Every Short Story, 1951 to 2012, which, for somebody who wanted to sort of an introduction to how your writing has changed and evolved and so on, this is a very good place to start. You say at the end of it, you sort of summarise Wordsworth, saying that he's right when he says that the younger we are, the brighter our world appears. And it seems to me that there's a strong sort of nostalgic yearning for the world of the 50s and 60s, the early post-war welfare state world, where there was a socialist, social democratic dream that seemed to be being built kind of brick by brick.
Yes. I agree.
Yes. I was hoping you might expatiate a little bit more, but there we are. These stories are always surrounded by your illustrations, and your writing and your drawing and your art have seemed to go hand in hand. When you look back at a collection like this, which goes back throughout your entire working life, do you recognise the person at the beginning? I mean, do you feel you have changed much in the writing of them?
No. I must have.
Yes.
All I know is that the first and earliest stories are full of extravagant fantasies, weird cultures, gigantic vertical cities, that the later ones become describe, I should say, more ordinary people, and though in fact they tend to get older and older and older, so that the last book of short stories was called The Ends of Our Tethers, because they seemed to me all about men of about my old age, or a bit my own age, or a bit older,
and a lot of working men. The other thing that struck me, there's a lot of apart from the fantasies and the alternative empires and the alternative worlds, there's a lot of writing about the workplace, people in offices, people in factories, and people actually doing things. And that in itself is harking back to the Glasgow, which was always hammering and steaming and busy and throbbing, in a way perhaps that the city has become less so these days.
Yes. No, I mean, I was invited a few years ago to a C&D gathering in Glasgow City's chambers, which was quite amazing because the Labour Party kept strong. Well, no, in recent years has kept itself as aloof as possible from any anti-nuclear stance. But at it, there was the provost wasn't there, but his deputy was, and said it's a cheering thought that nowadays modern Glasgow employed as many people in the tourist industry as formerly it had employed in shipbuilding and railway locomotive building, and obviously felt that this was a cheering thought. Whereas, to me, the idea that a country's economy depends on visitors coming here for a bit of fun and a change strikes me as horrible.
It goes back. Does it go back to the City of Culture, when Glasgow became European City of Culture? That seemed to be the moment when the big rebranding started.
Big rebranding.
Well, it was. It was.
Oh, yes, that's what they attempted.
Yeah.
City of Culture. They called in a lot of, I'm afraid, let me, South British arts administrators. So there was nothing of Glasgow culture presented. They could have had Joan Eardley, who'd been to Glasgow School of Art for paint, J.D. Ferguson. Mm-hmm. No Glasgow painters' works were, as far as drama was concerned, nothing by Bridie, J.P. Taylor, McClellan. They had a play by Dario Fo, with Robbie, a one-man show with Robbie Coltrane doing it. That was what you had of Scottish culture. And it was explained by one of the administrators who met me and Tom Leonard that the thing was that Glasgow had rather a bad reputation, sort of slums and red Clydesiders and that kind of thing. The job was to make Glasgow palatable to outsiders.
Ian Rankin.
I should say to listeners that it's always worth getting Alasdair's books in hardback, because he puts secret messages in there. When you take off the jacket, there's always a the outside of the actual hardback book is always beautifully inscribed and beautifully decorated. And on this one, there's a phrase that you use, work as if you live in the early days of a better country, that you've used before.
You'll find in that one, it actually says, work as if you live in the early days of a better world.
So it's a slight change, but you have used that phrase or something very like it before as well.
Yes.
So you must really believe that. I mean,
yes.
That thought really did inspire people. I mean, coming as it did on the cover of Lanark, the huge, fantastic novel, which just imagined completely different worlds based on a kind of Scottish reality. What Alasdair said about 1990 is partly true. It did involve parachuting in a lot of cultural events from outside, some of which, I must say, were hugely influential in changing young Scottish artists' ideas of what could be achieved, particularly in theatre. The theatre programme was run by Neil Wallace, who, is still a great programmer, now working in the Netherlands. And it did have a very interesting mix, really, of kind of Scottish and international stuff. But I think overall, in the whole run-up to 1990, and not all in the year 1990 itself, there was an attempt to get to grips with that industrial past you were talking about, with Glasgow's grief over no longer being the city that makes things. And the great iconic thing of that was George Wiley's straw locomotive sculpture, which I think was about 1988, was it 1989?
I think we've got to be careful. I mean, I totally agree with the nostalgia and the aspect of the extraordinary situation whereby a city in a very small country made things which were produced and transferred across the globe. I mean, it still amazes me that in the eve of the Great War, 2/5 of all ships built in the world were launched on the Clyde. But we are now in a Tina situation. There is no alternative. And of course tourism has been one of the factors reviving Glasgow. Who would have thought in the days of the black-suited, and that's SOOTED,
but
city,
also UITED as well.
And, city, that, you would have that. But don't let's forget that the major employment dynamic in the city is now further and higher education. And, that is bringing back Glasgow to the halcyon days of the great College of Glasgow in the 18th century Enlightenment. There are positive things to be said about the transformation of the city, as well as things that we wouldn't be particularly happy about in the way that Alasdair has described. But if you go back also to the period he's talking about of the 50s and 60s, I've just finished a piece for a Scottish newspaper on remembering the 60s, and that was a decade that really made me as a kind of adult. And it was a great time. There was virtually full employment in the early 60s. The universities were expanding. Pop music was coming into its own. And if you compare that period to the starkness of the reality, not least for young people in their teens and early 20s today, it's not surprising that people look back on that period with a tremendous sense of nostalgia, and I would say even longing.
Yes. I'd like to come on.
It was a reality.
Yeah. I think we should talk a little bit about demography in a minute, but before we do that, I want to talk about the National Theatre of Scotland particularly, and Joyce McMillan, you were talking about the theatrical developments that came out of 1990 and so on. But Scotland does have its own national theatre now, but it's not a sort of grand building with Corinthian columns and so on outside. It's a virtual theatre where it moves from space.
Theatre without walls.
Theatre without walls is what you say. Yes. And it has had English directors and English influence from early on, and there's been no problem there. Because we should say one of the big migrant groups into Scotland in recent years has been English.
Well, I always think that the decisive thing really is not where people come from, it's what they bring with them. I mean, if Vicky Featherstone, who's just now about to leave and come back to London to run the Royal Court, but she was the founding director of the National Theatre of Scotland from 2004. And Vicky arrived in Scotland already knowing an awful lot about the Scottish theatre scene. She'd particularly engaged with the playwrights, this terrific generation of playwrights, David Gregg, David Harrower, all the rest of them, who are around in Scotland just now. So she wasn't under any impression that she was coming from the centre to the periphery. She rather felt as if she was coming to somewhere where a lot of the action was, and that she knew about and that she wanted to engage further with. And I think if you come to Scotland, I mean, I've just done an interview with her, which will be published shortly, which really shows the extent to which she has been open to the whole idea that being in Scotland would be a transforming thing for her family, and that is typical of what you would call the right attitude to coming to a country like Scotland, because it is a different country, and if you're not prepared to kind of open yourself to that and learn things about it, then you're going to be in for a rough ride. If you come, on the other hand, with a closed mind, thinking you're just coming from the centre for a few years, teach the natives what to do, there's going to be a problem. So there hasn't been an issue at all about either Vicky or her associate director, John Tiffany, who came to Glasgow University in 1990 and was so inspired by a lot of the stuff that he saw then that he decided to stay. As for their repertoire and the fact that they don't have a theatre with walls, well, I think it's a really powerful metaphor for kind of modern thinking about nationhood. It's not about being over-centralised. It's not about being in one place. It's about being flexible. It's about having a hugely diverse model of what you can listen to and tell. And it's not so much about the past. I mean, I'm hearing what Alasdair's saying about some of the kind of classics of the Scottish repertoire not having been done, and that's true. But it is an awful lot about new work and about imagining new futures, which is, I think, a very healthy thing for theatre, but it's also a healthy thing for a nation.
I mean, one of the tremendous things I think that's happened to the nation over the last 20 years has been the movement into Scotland of people from outside Scotia. And I very much welcome, obviously there are people who don't deserve this praise, but I very much welcome the many thousands of English people, first-generation English people who have come into the country. 463,000 first-generation English in Scotland at the census of 2001, and another 100,000 Poles and other Eastern Europeans. I think you can see in the areas where they have settled and the contribution they have made, they have actually been a vibrant and productive part of the Scottish nation. Certainly the ones that I know become sometimes more Scottish than Scots.
That's true.
This is why the current Scottish government, I think quite rightly and positively, talks about the Scots as the people who live in Scotland. They now need to start talking about those Scots who left Scotland, who the Irish have embraced as their cousinhood.
Though part of the problem with that, as your last book about the Scottish diaspora showed, is the ersatz and sometimes rather dodgy nature of overseas Scotland. You taught this ludicrous thing about the kirking of the tartan, where they have great big tartan flags particularly in the southern part of the United States, and this strange sort of mixture of Confederate sort of militarism and Scottish militarism.
Very right wing.
Yeah, one of the
modern
phrases I
Scotland.
use, that some of these people dress up in a kind of combo of Charles Edward Stuart and one of the Confederate generals, Robert E. Lee, and this is ludicrous to most Scots.
Yeah. It really
And
is.
the other thing is that, especially at the higher level of the expatriate tycoonery in the USA, most of them are pretty right-wing, even to the right of the Republican Party, and a lot of them feel
Donald Trump with his golf course is not
Yes.
exactly a mainstream social democrat.
And the other people are the Forbes family. I can mention others whom I have met personally, and they regard Scotland as a desiccated nation because we have been destroyed, so they put it, by socialistic intervention and dependency culture. Now, that is the reason why it's going to be very, very difficult for the Scottish Government to make overtures. There is a gulf, cultural and indeed a political gulf between some of the expatriate communities, particularly in the USA, as you say, Andrew, but sometimes elsewhere, and the homeland,
Yeah.
in a way which doesn't exist in Ireland, and there are historical reasons for that.
And the recent Trump affair is very, very interesting from that point of view. I mean, I don't know how much...
This is the
Yeah.
the attempt to put a
That
big golf
Donald
course on the
Trump,
East Coast.
whose granny came from Lewis or somewhere and spoke Gaelic, and who therefore fancies himself as an expatriate Scot, has actually been destroying a kind of unique Scottish landscape in the shape of the sand dunes along the east coast at Many in order to build this golf resort, and sort of chucking the local residents all out, or trying to get the local residents
What
out of
about
their...
the recalcitrance
out
of the
their
prize
homes.
given
And the
to
prize,
the farmer?
well, this is the hilarious thing, that last week, the Scot of the Year prize was given to the most dogmatic and stubborn of the farmers, who has refused to move, and Donald Trump is now boycotting
I
the
think that's
whisky company,
wonderful. I think that's
which
great.
awarded the prize. So there is obviously a bit of a culture war about the nature of Scotland there. He wants his idealised image of Scotland as a sort of place of golf courses with rich people
Yes.
playing golf and pipers dotted about. The people of Many just want to live on their beautiful sand dunes as they have been living.
Can I ask a sort of what we call a daft laddie question? Is there any connection between sort of cultural and imaginative vitality and political change in the country? Because you might say that if you look at the Scotland of the 1980s, when there was a huge number of new publishing houses and great novels coming out, a lot of the sort of more representational Scottish artists coming out of the Edinburgh and Glasgow art schools
And
at
history
that time.
writing.
History
Yes,
writing,
fantastic.
magazines and so on. That was a fantastically creative time. But much less so in politics. Now we have a time where politics is moving very fast. Does that mean there's any reason why we should have a sort of creative renaissance to go alongside it? Or is it just the reverse? Is there a sort of certain amount of psychic energy that could be poured into politics or could be poured into culture, but not at the same time?
Well, I definitely think there's a sense in which when politics is failing you, is there not a song by the Proclaimers about what do you do when democracy fails you? The answer is you become a songwriter or a playwright. And I think there's a kind of element of that if there's something to be against, it does tend to sort of animate and excite the creative community into imagining new worlds. But I don't know if that
Alasdair
means...
Gray was vigorously shaking his head, I think, at that point. Were you?
I don't know. I wasn't looking at myself.
You were shaking your head.
Now, what was being said at the time?
I was asking whether there is any connection between cultural sort of efflorescence and vitality and political ditto, or whether they actually ran against each other.
I think that is one of the... Sorry, I was going to say, one of these stupid either-or ways of presenting a question. Is it on this side or is it on that side?
It tends to be how human communication often advances, isn't it? It's called dialectic.
No, it tends to
we
be...
like to be where extremes meet. We like to be where extremes
Meet, as Hugh McDermott would say.
If we're talking about what Hegelian dialectics or even Marxist dialectics, one side or the other, I just don't think in these terms, and I believe
I tend to think in cause-effect terms, so to some extent I'm with you, Andrew, on this. I think there's clear evidence that the 1980s was a period of shock and stagnation in Scottish politics, most of it anyway, and especially during the period when the deindustrialisation process took place, the post-devolution thing. Mm-hmm. As you say rightly, that was a period of quite robust development in terms of the arts, and I read that right across the board. So I would have thought in terms of the engagement in and the thickening of a sense of Scottishness, then the variable of the arts was very important as an influence in the 1980s, going through into the period of political engagement in the 1990s. Mm-hmm. Now I would go along with Alasdair. I think the situation now is melded. Mm-hmm. It would be impossible really to separate out the parallelisms, because there's almost a kind of intellectual chaotic effect going on, which I think unfortunately does not necessarily, we went back to this earlier, does not necessarily always engage the man in the street. We know that the man in the street reads Ian Rankin, but is the man in the street reading some of the sort of stuff that perhaps later scholars will think about as vital to the development of a Scottish national consciousness? It's a big question for me.
Yeah, well, I mean, the old Chinese proverb, "May you live in interesting times," as a creative artist, it's always good to live in interesting times, because it gives you lots of material to work with. And with this new book out, I've been travelling all around the world and doing interviews all around the world, and people are interested in Scotland. They're interested in the Scottish experiment. They're interested in what's going to happen in the next year or two, and they're always asking, how's the vote going to go, and can Scotland make it? And places, Istanbul, where I was recently, they were asking me that question. I mean, it's not just in places, not just places with a Scots diaspora, although I get asked that a lot in New Zealand and Australia and Canada, obviously, but other countries as well, and of course Spain, Catalonia, but the south of Italy versus the north of Italy, they're saying, there's a lot of people are very, so the story has moved out there, and the people who are taking that story to the world tend to be the people working in the creative arts. So, because people are either seeing TV or films made in Scotland,
those are the
or
people
they're reading
that
books
the
set in
international
Scotland.
media and interest groups come to. I mean, for example, in my own school, we get contacts from the international media 2, 3, 4 times a week, because what's fascinating them is this country, that is Great Britain, dominated the world for 2.5 centuries, and it's an object of fascination to them that this extraordinary set of influences, that the two keystones of it may be starting to separate. And therefore it's no coincidence that it's not just the diaspora who are interested, it's the global audience. Ian's unambiguously right. It has put Scotland, whatever happens, on the map in a big, big way.
Meanwhile, is there a pressure on people to take sides? I mean, is there an attempt to marshal creative artists and writers into the different camps?
Yes.
I mean, presumably. I mean, because you were very carefully saying you've got people in both camps in the Rebus.
Yeah, but I think if you were to talk to the Yes campaign, they would say that I'm unambiguous in the No campaign. And I don't know why they would say that, but it has been said to me in the past by some of them that I'm obviously, because Rebus would vote no, obviously, therefore I must be in the No camp. Yeah, I know. They can't separate fact from fiction, or history from, or reality from fiction. No, I mean there is, and artists are, will occasionally be able to get together and prove themselves to be an immovable force. This happened when Creative Scotland looked like it was taking some very bad, wrong directions, and a letter was signed by several hundred people in the arts community in Scotland, and change is now afoot. So, I mean, the artistic, I hate to use the word community because we're very disparate and we hardly ever meet up, but there's a lot of us in this game, a lot of us doing this job.
A lot of them around this table included are being asked, when are you going to come out?
Yes.
When you're going to come out, and presumably you must find
come out and
come out
state
as a
your
yes
position.
or a no. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
But we have no doubt.
I've always said
we have no doubt where you stand, Alasdair.
That's all right.
But there is ambiguity elsewhere.
Absolutely, and presumably you feel it particularly on the Scotsman, where the Scotsman is the sort of one of the great prizes which both sides want to have in their pocket.
Yes, I mean, I think broadly, I mean, I don't speak for the editorial line of The Scotsman because I'm really only a freelance contributor, but I think its line is still broadly unionist. But it does have a lot of SNP supporting commentators and columnists in its pages. So it's kind of reflecting both sides of the argument, but still coming down, I would say, broadly on the unionist side. But I mean, it's a very interesting debate, and I think it does put the cultural community in a slightly strange position because it's a very, very sharp political debate. It's not actually
there's no grey, no shades of grey.
Yeah, it's not. Well, there are shades of grey, but they're not being represented on the ballot.
At least 50
paper.
of them, as far as the last
yes,
count.
of course, yes, and Scotland's erotic life has been completely put on the back burner. Where we all no, that's not the case. And
that's a news line.
It's a very sharp political debate. So far, it's not been a very high level of political debate among the political classes.
I was wondering about this.
And it's kind of quite boring to artists.
Well, I mean,
think,
that's absolutely true.
Ways.
And I think Ian put his finger on it earlier. I mean, hardly any of the vital questions can or ever will be answered
by it.
So you're entering almost an intellectual vacuum. It's a bit like me always saying the future's not my period. because there is very little in the way to debate. It's all about vision, hope, aspiration and risk.
And also, we'll fix that later.
Yes.
We'll tell you later.
But I mean, it is a national disgrace, a democratical disgrace, that the political parties did not manage to hew out a third question along the devolution maximus line.
Yeah.
Because that, as we speak, is by far the option that most Scottish people, even the proverbial man in the street, would probably support.
And it's not going to be available to be voted
It's
on.
an anti-democratic referendum, in my view.
And there is something deep about that, which is that although the debate is quite divisive and kind of 50-50, I would say, in the kind of chattering classes at the moment, all of the kind of cultural energy, or almost all of it, I would say, is more on the yes side, and that's reflected in the political campaigns, in that the no campaign, while it has a lot of residual strength, among people who are very cautious about the idea of Scottish independence, has this incredible kind of dreary, backward-looking, fear-mongering negativity about it, and that is something that is very hard to relate.
It's because it's a no campaigin.
Yeah.
It's not a yes to the union campaign. If it was a yes campaign, that immediately seems more positive.
I'll wager that 6 months before the referendum, the unionist parties will come out with a devolution maximus statement if they win the referendum.
Well, we will see. Thank you to all my guests. We've run out of time. Joyce Macmillan there, Tom Devine's To the Ends of the Earth. His final work in the Scotland trilogy is out now in paperback. Ian Rankin's Standing in Another Man's Grave and Alasdair Gray's Every Short Story, 1951 to 2012, are both available in hardback. Next week, Alchemy, Curiosity and a Lingering Death, with Peter Wathers, Sanjeev Gupta and Helen Burnham. But for now, thank you and goodbye.
There are many more Radio 4 arts and discussion programmes to download for free. Find these on the website at bbc.co.uk/Radio4.
And so what we tend to do is just go about our business and try and make it through the recession.
Alasdair Gray, you've had in your writing many sort of imagined empires, worlds, states, different kinds of Scotland and Scottishness. What do you make of the current mood?
I haven't the faintest idea. Current mood, like somebody feeling their temperature every minute or taking their pulse every minute to compare it with how it was an hour ago.
You don't feel you're living through a particularly momentous time in Scottish history at the moment?
History is continual. I don't think there's any year that is more momentous in the history of the world or the history of a nation than any other. There's every year there's some form of political crisis. I mean, to me, the formative crisis that turned me towards from a solid Labour supporter into a Scottish supporter of Scottish Home Rule, if you don't mind me using an ancient phrase that the Irish were quite fond of, was the discovery that the welfare state, which I thought was the greatest, made...
Thanks for downloading this episode of Start the Week. For more details about Start the Week, please go to bbc.co.uk/Radio4. I hope you enjoy the programme. Hello, we are approaching the end of what has been an interesting and possibly even momentous year in the politics of Scotland, which means the country will vote in 2014 on leaving the United Kingdom or not, and there's already campaigning going on both sides. A campaign so long it will make US presidential contests look like a hop and a skip. Today we're talking not about voting systems or economic models, but something both vaguer and also more important, which is the mood of the country. I'm joined by some of Scotland's most prominent writers. The pioneer Glaswegian pedestrian Alasdair Gray, whose novel Lanark inspired a generation of writers and whose collected short stories have just been published. By the cultural commentator and journalist Joyce Macmillan. By Scotland's best-known current historian Tom Devine, and by the only begetter of Rebus, Edinburgh's own criminal mastermind Ian Rankin. Thanks to all of you. Can we just start with a bit of a historical perspective, Professor Devine? We've seen a very, very intense series of changes in Scottish politics with the rise of the SNP and stuff over the last 20 years and so on. We now have a date for the referendum, still arguments over the actual question itself. Is all of this percolating into sort of...
Ombudsman about the precise legalistic process that would be necessary for an independent Scotland to join the European Union. And stuff like that is very exciting to political wonks like me, to political journalists and to politicians. I don't think, as Ian says, that it's the talk of the steamy. And my feeling is that there is actually less popular engagement with these constitutional issues at the moment than there was in the 1990s in the run-up to the coming of the Scottish Parliament, which really was a momentous
when there were big social movements like the convention.
Yes, and there was a huge consensus in Scottish civil society that Parliament was wanted and needed, whereas the question of full independence is quite divisive for Scottish society.
I think there's two reasons for this. First of all, as already been said, the depth of the national economic crisis is such that people have got much more pressing concerns in their daily lives and for their families. But the second reason is, I think, that 2014 has come about almost by political accident. It has not come about, as perhaps the Devolution Bill came about, by a rush of mass public opinion. Two things happened in Scotia in the early part of the millennium. First of all, the Labour Party's hegemony disintegrated and the SNP moved in. And the second thing is they have been seen, at least for the first two periods, to have been behaving competently in government. So they win a landslide victory. And because...
public debate in Scotland?
Well, some people say it's become so endless, it's become humdrum because, there has aspects to the debate which perhaps are not as productive so far as people thought they might be. But I think if people take a kind of long historical lens on this, I mean, we are living through truly historic times because you'll recall that, the Union itself was hardly challenged, not even in terms of reforming it, between the mid-18th century and the 1960s and 1970s. So whatever happens in 2014, this is going to be a period that future scholars in my discipline will have to try and explain how this came about.
Sort of asymmetric climate change, sudden global warming or something like that.
At the moment, it's a semi-mystery.
Yes. Ian Rankin, same sort of question. What do you? I mean, you, in all of your Rebus novels, we always see something of what's going on in Scotland at the time, references.
I mean, it certainly seems to be something that is filling the pages of newspapers and hours of radio and occasionally on TV, but I don't get a sense when you're in the shops or the pub or the cafes that it's the hottest topic on people's minds. And in some way that might be because of the saturation in the media, that every day in the media there's something else you can be reading on this, and it will be an opposing point of view. It will be an economist saying, no, that economist yesterday was completely wrong. So there's nothing for you to...
Post-war Britain, an example to the rest of the world, was being steadily dismantled. And that's why I thought, well, the English Westminster government is doing it. The Scottish Labour Party is cooperating with it. Anyway, Salmon's government has abolished prescription charges and is ensuring that at least Scottish students at further colleges of education don't have to pay fees. They're trying to maintain a bit of or reinstate the welfare state that has been demolished in England. Good.
Good. All right, Joyce Macmillan, Scotland has a national theatre, but not a national theatre with walls. We're going to come in and talk about that a bit later on. But what's your take? Does this feel like a momentous time to you?
Well, it feels as if it's very momentous in terms of the formal politics, but I think it's also telling us things, and Ian hinted at this, about the relationship between formal politics and most people's lives, which is that it is, I think, all across the UK and maybe all across the West, increasingly tenuous. So the politicians and political journalists are tremendously excited about this run-up to 2014 and the debate that's going on and the technicalities. You know, this week the big story in Scotland has been a supposed scoop by my newspaper, the